Hello friends and welcome to the discussion on human anatomy. Myself Dr. Ashwani Kumar, and we will start our discussion in human anatomy from the head and neck portion. So let's begin with the head and neck part. The reason I am starting with head and neck because in the head and neck we'll talk about the cranial nerve nuclei, and then we'll talk about the blood vessels of the head and neck, and finally we'll go to the triangles that you read in first year, and we probably were not able to understand those triangles very clearly because we knew nothing about the cranial nerves, we knew nothing about the blood vessels of head and neck, and we directly switched to those triangles. This time we'll have a slightly retrograde approach. We'll start with the cranial nerve discussion, and then we will go to this the rest of the triangle thing in the last, so that it will make more sense. So let me begin the discussion with the neural tube. Although we will talk about this neural tube in detail in the embryology part, but the reason I want to discuss the neural tube is because I want to see where exactly the cranial nerve nuclei are developing from. Now let us say you are looking at this neural tube here, and I have divided this neural tube by a primitive sulcus called as sulcus limitans. This is called as sulcus limitans, which is dividing the neural tube in two parts. This portion is called as the alar plate, and this one is called as the basal plate. So we have the alar plate and the basal plate part of the neural tube. And if you compare this neural tube with the spinal cord, and let us say you are having a section of the spinal cord, you are drawing a line from the middle of the spinal cord, that's the same way you divide it. I mean, we have a dorsal part and the ventral part. So this alar plate is nothing but representing the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and that's why it is sensory in function. Or in other word, I should say that any cranial nerve nuclei which will develop in the alar plate will be sensory because it is in the dorsal horn region over here. Basal plate is corresponding to the ventral horn of the spinal cord, or I can say it is motor in function. With the cranial nerve point of view, I can say all the sensory nuclei will develop in the alar plate, all the motor nuclei will develop in the basal plate. For an example, if I give you the example of, let's say, the hypoglossal nucleus, now what will you say? Hypoglossal nucleus will develop in the alar plate or the basal plate. Now all you have to decide whether the hypoglossal nucleus is sensory or motor. It's a motor nucleus, it supplies the muscles of tongue, so it will develop into the basal plate. If I give you the example of the sensory trigeminal nucleus, it will develop into the alar plate. Nucleus of tractus solitarius, again alar plate because it is sensory in function. So one simple straight question which is asked in the exam, they will give you 4 cranial nerve nuclei and will ask which of them is derived from the basal plate and which of them is from the alar plate. So all you have to decide whether it is sensory or it is motor. If it is sensory, the answer is alar plate, and if it is motor, your answer will be the basal plate of the neural tube. Now this is the neural tube we are considering here, and let's say this cavity inside will give rise to the central canal of the spinal cord. Let's say this neural tube is forming the spinal cord, so I would say this is going to give rise to the central canal of the spinal cord. Now you cannot have the same arrangement in the case of brainstem. Now imagine you are looking at the neural tube which is going to form the brainstem, that is pons and medulla oblongata and midbrain. Then you cannot have a central canal inside. Instead, what you'll have there? You'll have 4th ventricle. So now look at me. If let's say this is the basal plate and alar plate. If you have this plate over here which is the alar plate, and below we have the basal plate. That's the arrangement we have. And when this neural tube will open up in this manner to accommodate the 4th ventricle inside, and it will open up like this. So look at where my alar plate is going. My alar plate is going toward the lateral side. this is what is going to happen when this neural tube will open up to accommodate the fourth ventricle inside. This LR plate will be shifted toward the lateral side, and that is the reason where you have most of your cranial nerve nuclei which are sensory in function toward the lateral side. The best example is lateral medullary syndrome and medial medullary syndrome. Now when you look at the case of lateral medullary syndrome, it is usually about the sensory deficits. Why sensory deficits? Mainly sensory deficits, because all these sensory nuclei are shifted toward the lateral side, whereas motor nuclei are converged toward the medial side of the neural tube, and that is because of the opening of the neural tube. So let us have a discussion on how this neural tube will open up, and then we'll have the cranial nerve nuclei present in them. So let's start from here only. So there we have it. Let's say the neural tube has opened up now. So this is the neural tube which has opened up, and if this was the region of sulcus limitans, see, this is how the neural tube has opened up, and that's the region of the sulcus limitans. I'm just writing SL, sulcus limitans. So I can say this portion was the basal plate, and that's the LR plate. So all the motor nuclei should be here, and all the sensory nuclei should be here, and this is the region of fourth ventricle. Now look at this, the neural tube has opened up and it is accommodating the fourth ventricle inside, and we have the basal and the LR plate. So you will have the motor nuclei developing in the basal plate, and we'll have sensory nuclei developing in the LR plate here. Now all these are the motor nuclei I should say it's a set of the motor nuclei, so we call them the motor column or the efferent column. So motor nuclei or the efferent column. Whereas all these are the sensory nuclei which are present in the afferent column or the sensory one. So this is how the neural tube is divided, and we have the efferent column and the afferent column related to the basal plate and the LR plate. Now we need to decide that what are the motor nuclei we have and what are the sensory nuclei, and then we will place them inside the brainstem and see what all nuclei will come under these columns.